So,
oh, I like that.
Yeah. Wow.
So maybe shall we start before the situation gets worse?
Right.
So okay. So this is my part on behalf of the painting department of the University of Arts in Poznan. I have this incredible honor and pleasure to host today Jeff Kōan Baysa in discourse and dialogue with Donald Kunze, with the lecture titled "Swooning Over Art," an MD and a Ph.D. chase down some rabbit holes. I would, as usual, I would have the pleasure to read a few words about our interlocutors, which we're so happy to have today. Jeff Kōan Baysa is a medical doctor, which is quite unusual, and a contemporary art curator altogether. Born and raised in Hawaii, and he divides his time between Honolulu, New York, and Los Angeles. His current practice bridges medical culture and social sculpture and includes clinical research in the neuroscience of memory and olfaction, human sensory perception and misperception, neurodiversity, and the cultural constructs of wellness, disease, and aesthetics. Dr. Baysa is a member of the Association of International Art Critics and an alumnus of the Whitney Museum Independent Study Program. His position includes Chief Medical Officer, Medical Avatar, co-founder Joshua Treenial, Senior Founder Honolulu Biennial, Director-iBiennale, Program Board Advisor at Art Omai, Culture Advisor, World Council of Peoples for the United Nations, Alumnus-Advisory Committee of the Vera List Center for Art and Politics, Culture Agent-Curators Network, International Advisor-Dag, Hammarskjold Plaza, Advisory Board, Kraus, Australia, Rotterdam, the Netherlands. Ford Foundation grantee, asked to survey contemporary art in Vietnam. He has curated exhibitions in China, Japan, Chile, Croatia, Mexico, Korea, Austria, Canada, Ireland, England, Ukraine, Holland, United Arab Emirates, as well as throughout the United States. The Pacific editor of D'Art International in Toronto, Canada. He has lectured at the United Nations, MoMA, Whitney Museum, Metropolitan Museum, Phillips Collection, Hanoi University of Culture, University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, and the Krasnov Institute for Advanced Study at the George Mason University. Dr. Baysa was the 2020 critic in residence for the Great Meadows Foundation in Louisville, Kentucky, and serves as the curatorial advisor for the Fresh Winds Biennale in Iceland and the Congo Biennale in Kinshasa at the Democratic Republic of Congo. The series of Congo, sorry. His upcoming projects include Exposure, Native Art and Political Ecology, opening at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Native Art in Santa Fe, New Mexico, USA in August 21. His section addresses the sequelae of radiation exposure in native peoples from the nuclear testing in the Pacific, specifically French Polynesia and Micronesia. Others are looking at similar issues in Greenland, Canada, Australia, Japan, and the American Southwest. In development with others in an exhibition with the working title Light and Space Artists 3.0, Time and Experience, an update with newer generation artists influenced by the West Coast art movement of the 60s. He was driven by the new technologies and materials of the engineering and aerospace industries located in Southern California within its singular atmosphere of sunlight, land, and ocean. So this is Koan, and now we have the second person we have the honor to have with us today, Donald Kunze. He's taught an architecture, studio theory, general arts and criticism, and seminars on theory, film, and landscape architecture at Penn State, with fellowship semesters at the University at Buffalo, and LSU Russell Fellow, and Washington Alexandra Architecture Center, an extension of Virginia Tech. His professional took up graduate studies in geography, first at Georgia State University for a master's degree, then at Penn State University for a Ph.D. He broadened his thesis studies to include critical theory and the philosophy of Giambattista Vico, with side interests in Ernst Cassirer and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. After graduating in 1983, he joined the architecture faculty at Penn State and later accepted a split position between architecture and integrative arts. He has lectured at the University of Pennsylvania, at Buffalo, Yale, and Carleton, LSU, and Harvard. He revised his dissertation to publish it as a study of Vico theory of imagination and place in 1986 with Peter Lang. He has authored articles on film theory, the sense of place, literature in the fantastic metalepsis, hysteria, extromission, and the death drive. He co-curated an exhibit, Sternglass and Prozencept, with Koan Jeff Baysa, MD in New York in 2004. In the past 10 years, he has been increasingly involved with the Lacanian psychoanalysis and the work of Slavoj Žižek, and presently is one of the founding members on ISPA, an organization interested with combining architecture and psychoanalysis. With Dr. Baysa, he plans to extend the Stendall Syndrome effect in the study of the fourth wall of cinema and the theater as a model of reception in the arts, including architecture. He currently produces instructional videos on anamorphosis and the uncanny in architecture, Vico and Lacan. Ladies and gentlemen, despite the radical weather today, we have enormous pleasure to welcome Donald Kunze and Jeff Baysa in the session, which is one of the lectures from the series called the Field Studio Talks. And the series of the on-time lectures is dedicated to encounter with the critical thought of the most renowned contemporary theoreticians, art critics, curators, and artists. At the time of the pandemic solitary confinement, we believe that with our effort, the fourth physical distance can be reshaped into the advantage of the greater proximity in exchange of ideas. Please welcome, without further ado, welcome Koan, Donald. We're all yours.
Thank you so much, Dominic. It's a pleasure to be here in this esteemed company, and grateful for the invitation and for the partnership with Donald. We've known each other for quite a while and have been talking about collaborating on things. So this is very exciting for us and an honor for me. Thank you very much. I just want to mention the way that Dominique and I have interacted before. So there was a solo exhibition at MoCA London in which we participated together. There's an exhibition in Yokohama, Japan, in which we presented Dominique's work as well. And also in Switzerland, there was a fantastic gathering in the Swiss Alps. And Dominique was, we had a lovely projection on the slopes of ghostly figures skiing amongst other skiers. So that was really a pleasure to work with Dominique over the years. So let me just, I'm going to launch into the presentation. I've done this. Let's see if I can pull this off again. It's taking a little while to respond. Hang on. Maybe I should try again because it's not responding. Hang on. you see that?
Yes.
You can. Okay, great. Fantastic. So I'm basically, as this is winding up, I'm basically a clinician.
If you're still trying to figure out how to start an online business or how to get people to...
Uh-oh. That's not what I want. Okay. Let me go back. Can you see that?
No.
No?
No.
Okay, hang on a second. I'm going to try this again. Okay. For some reason, the share button doesn't seem to be responding here, which is strange because we did try it before everyone came on. Maybe it just takes a while to load. Hang on. Okay, here we go. Let's try this.
Uh-huh. Something is moving.
Okay. Oops.
Yeah.
Okay, hang on.
Cool.
Okay. Let me see. It's full screen. Can you see that now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So great. I'll just run through these this slide presentation quickly. That's our end title. And again, I'm a clinician mainly interested in the intersection of science and art. And so things like this, Stendall Syndrome, and the relationship of the olfactory sense and memory are of great interest to me from a clinical standpoint. So you may be already familiar with Stendall Syndrome, which is a psychosomatic condition that has these visceral manifestations when people, individuals are exposed to objects or phenomena of great beauty. The slides will be slow to load, but I'm taking this one at a time. So 2 years ago, this man had experienced a heart attack while admiring the birth of Venus, which is in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, Italy. Now, there has been no direct cause and effect relationship, but this phenomenon was placed in the category of Stendall Syndrome, which actually had been studied or reported by Graziella Magarini in Florence. Let's see what the next slide shows. Who reported 106 victims who had been taken to her emergency room directly from art galleries and museums in Florence. Actually had the opportunity to be in contact with Dr. Magarini about the syndrome that she had named. The visceral complaints, psychosomatic complaints included dizziness, heart palpitations, hallucinations, disorientation, and the other things you see on the screen, loss of identity and physical exhaustion. That's at Ponte Vecchio in Florence. In an updated interview, she said the phenomenon was applied exclusively to foreign tourists, and an unusual number of them had just viewed Michelangelo's David. So this is described by Marie-Henri Beyle, aka Stendhal, who's a 19th century romantic writer, and he had this experience.
This video takes a look at how we take inventories of what we see and find in the world.
Donald?
From very large and ambiguous things like landscapes to very small things like curious objects we might find in a flea market.
Hang on.
There are different kinds of inventories and different ways
from your, I don't know what's happening.
Okay, hang on.
Like to depart from the normal way of describing experiences as meanings that require more meanings.
It's moved on to another show. Do you want to stop and I can share it from my end?
Supplementing what we see.
Hang on a second. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Okay. So when he was viewing the frescoes at the Basilica of Santa Croce in Florence, he said that he had these symptoms of palpitations, attack of the nerves, and that the life was ebbing out of him and walked in fear of falling. So it's not just limited to Florence. There are other cities, including these cities here, Venice, Rome, and Istanbul, have also been linked to these symptoms by various other authors. And this is a view of Istanbul, of course. There are other syndromes similar. There's one called Jerusalem syndrome, observed by this physician that's identified there at the psychiatric hospital. And then some arguments about that the power and aura of Jerusalem is what overcame people, or there were maybe some pre-existing conditions. It was described as an ethereal magnet for already troubled souls. It'd be part of the discussion in terms of what these predisposing factors might be. The Paris syndrome is a bit different. Again, you can read that it's described by this Japanese psychiatrist in France, and 20 tourists, most of them Japanese, were affected by the disorder in 2011, succumbing to extreme culture shock and the shattering of the romantic image of the city. So this is another phenomenon, but the manifestation had to do with the reality of going to Paris when Japanese tourists expected high culture and fashion at every corner, but were confronted with the homeless people, the dirty streets, and occasionally the rude Parisian. So it was actually a gap between expectation and reality. So there are other notable individuals who have been affected by Stendall syndrome. So Sigmund Freud, about severe feelings when he visited the Acropolis. And Dostoevsky experienced paralysis and absence when visiting Basel's Hans Holbein's La Crise Mort au Tombeau. And at this Rothko Chapel in Texas, where Philip Hook said that there was something about the large expanses of color that the artist deploys that put the viewer in touch with the absolute or the sublime. So is it a sense of tapping into something spiritual, profound, and sensory that causes people to have these visceral reactions? There are other examples, but I'm limiting it to specific ones. So they're not only works of art, but magnificent landscapes have also been implicated in inducing Stendall syndrome. So something that closely resembles syncope or fainting or a sexual climax in the presence of architecture or landscapes. So listomania was also coined as a phrase to describe the extreme swooning during performances of Franz Liszt. I was also going to comment that something similar happened with Elvis Presley's fans, which was described as hysteria at the time. And I'm sure Donald will have some comments on hysteria as well. There are artists, this Icelandic artist tried to reproduce the symptoms of Stendall Syndrome, which a large-scale painting viewed from afar with a magnifying glass and then observed close up. There are no reports of actually having people faint or swoon in the presence or experiencing her work, however, but an attempt. There's also, I'm not sure if Warren's in the audience, but there is this experimental science field that combines neuropsychological research that relates to Stendall Syndrome. Warren actually established artbrain.org in 1996. And he was last week's lecture, I believe, or a previous lecture. So in terms of neuroimaging studies, there have been, starting in 2005, the identification of the orbital frontal cortex as the nexus for sensory integration and modulation of visceral reactions. There was an update in the next slide in 2011, I believe. Hang on a second. Professor Samir Zeki, who's also known for studying neuroaesthetics in London, and the Japanese physician also identified the orbital frontal cortex, part of the brain's reward circuit, as implicated in these symptoms as well. And the next update in 2019, with newer imaging studies, felt that aesthetic experiences were thought to be caused by the activation of the anterior insular cortex, which is in communication with the orbitofrontal region. And then you can read the second description about the neuronal networks with introspection and other processes. So this is something that Donald has been, in the introduction, Dominic had mentioned Donald's studying of other phenomena. So this static epilepsy is one of them. They share symptoms and mechanisms with Stendall Syndrome, and certain parts of the brain have been associated with these otoscopic phenomena. So there's otoscopy, where you view the environment from a different perspective. There's also hutoscopy, which is kind of a reduplicate hallucination of seeing one's body from a distance, and also out-of-body experiences, in which usually sensation is one of floating and observing one's body as well. And then Donald has done some research into near-death syndromes and imminent death situations as well. So it's not listed, this Stendall syndrome is not listed on the diagnostic and the DSM-5, which is a list of mental disorders. And so the discussion points after we hear from Donald's presentation as well is that Stendall syndrome is most likely a polymorphic entity, so there should be individualized analysis of the phenomenon. Is it reproducible or consistent? There was one patient who described having symptoms with viewing Van Gogh's sunflowers in London, but not the ones in Amsterdam. And predisposing factors, seizure disorders or psychiatric disorders or other medical conditions, stress, which includes insomnia, stress for the body, dehydration and poor nutrition, hypoglycemia, etc. And cultural factors, religious beliefs, what are the symptoms induced at the Wailing Wall that we saw under the Jerusalem syndrome? the experience of seeing the actual David's, Michelangelo's David at the Uffizi in Florence in its gigantic and wondrous posturing versus after having seen it only on a printed page in like a diminished capacity. And then I already mentioned the tourist variation in Paris, in which the romanticized expectations resulted in disappointment, anger, and frustration, and other symptoms. I think that is the last slide I have. So I'm going to stop and hand it back to Donald.
Thanks, Koan.
There we go. Okay, are we back?
Yes.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, I'll try to get into this fairly quickly. Here we are. Oh, wrong one, sorry. Okay, can you see? Can you all see this?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay, good.
You want to make it full screen, or no?
Yeah, I will.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks, Dominique and crew. I've really enjoyed this series of lectures at the University of the Arts. Fantastic, high quality, very provocative talks about the nature of art and our experience of it. When Koan got me to think about the Stendahl Syndrome, I was simply thinking in too narrow a channel. I had no idea how broad this could possibly be, but I immediately started connecting it to some other things. I first wanted to learn about just what it involved, a kind of hysteria. Whereas, you know, in hysteria, we feel pleasure but report it as pain, or the reverse can happen. We feel pain and report it as pleasure. But I remember the movie, The Great Beauty, La Grande Bellezza, where the opening scene involves a clear case of the Stendall Syndrome. There is this beautiful music that I believe is comes from this. Well, I'm going to skip that. A Japanese tourist wanders away from the group, takes a look at the panorama of Rome, and collapses immediately. Rome has been implicated in a lot of Stendall syndromes. You remember the phrase, see Rome and die. You don't know if that's a promise or a threat. But in the movie, someone told me that there's an inscription, Roma o morte. So we know they've been thinking about it for quite a while. But the poster child for the Stendall Syndrome is, of course, Botticelli's Birth of Venus, which, if you look at the painting closely and think about its content, it's almost a brushstroke by brushstroke account of the Stendall Syndrome. That is, we have Venus appearing out of almost nowhere, standing on a shell, being blown by Boreas, the wind. And of course, it's Simonetta Vespucci, the most famous model of the Quattrocento, a beautiful woman by all accounts. And as we can see here, that her reputation preceded her. So in effect, the painting itself is an account of the Stendall Syndrome. Now, I started to think of the Stendall Syndrome as a case of the fourth wall. We all know the fourth wall from cinema theory. It's the idea that something happens in a room with four walls. We take one of them away.
That face that is usually covered by her phone has finally made an appearance. That face is laughing. That face is expressive.
I don't know what's going on.
One syllable at a time.
Koan, could you check that?
You're staying at a verbal
sorry.
house. The most you normally get.
Sorry.
Oh, okay. see if I can get my business back here. Okay, is that coming through okay?
Yep.
The fourth wall is in cinema where you put the cameras and the lights and the director sits and all of that. The idea is by taking one wall away, you allow the audience an intimate view of an interior life. But we can apply the idea of the fourth wall, to, of course, to theater, where it's quite obvious it's taken up by the proscenium arch. But also, my argument is that we can apply it to painting, to music, to architecture, to other places where we don't have a kind of simplistic division between a stage space and an auditorium space. The fourth wall is something that mediates our experience of art. It creates an interior and an exterior, and it tries to manage the relation between these two spaces through a principle that I found the best word for it is idempotency. Idempotency, if you've never heard the word before, comes from electrical engineering. It's the elevator switch or button. When you push the button and the elevator is coming, you push it again if it's too slow. But of course, pushing it again makes no difference whatsoever. But there's an idempotency function in the dream, which insulates the sleeper from external disturbances so that sleep can allow the sleeper to be paralyzed. And in effect, we translate this experience to painting and other forms of art when we intend to fix the viewer in relation to the viewed, to hold them in thrall. I got this idea not from myself. I don't know big words like idempotency or electrical engineering, but a friend of mine in Oakland, California, an electrical engineer, Ali Reza Moharar, introduced it to me. It's very useful, I find, to talk about how we seem to overcome our abstract position in the auditorium, looking at the work of art. If we see it as an homeostasis function, we see that as kind of a self-adjusting filter that allows us to have varying degrees of intimacy with a work of art. So to model this, I use the idea of the numerical palindrome. You can think of a stimulus as something that raises a kind of pressure in a system and has to be matched somehow. If you think of a palindromic series, 2, 3, 4, if you have another match on the other side, 4, 3, 2, you'll have a constant value called a sigma value of 6. So you can think of an electrical circuit as something that needs to maintain a constant flow of energy but not be overloaded. This palindrome feature is a little bit something like what happens in the Stendall, is that the palindrome gives way and leads to a kind of deconstructive force that seems to emanate from the work of art. But I was curious because Stendall seems to come up at the same time that Baedekers come up. That is when foreigners start to go to Europe, travel around, see great works of art. And I wondered, what is the Stendall effect before it was the Stendall
representation effect? And a space to look at that representation. Do we think of this as cutting 360 degrees into two parts? Or do we treat the space of representation as a whole?
Sorry, that was all my fault. I'm going to shut several things off here. Okay. This is sort of like the joke about somebody who said he knew Doris Day before she was a virgin. I always ask this about anything I know before we find something suddenly appearing, like anamorphosis, suddenly appears in the 1500s. We have to ask, what was it before it appeared in the particular form that we encounter it then? I think if we look at an older form, the pilgrimage, we find some very interesting parallels. It's the idea that we are anticipating an encounter and we have associated anxiety with our approach to that encounter. We go through, our pilgrims go through a series of preparations. The journey itself is more than half the fun of getting there. And it prepares people for the ecstasy of the final encounter. Interestingly, when gaslight replaced candles in theatrical performances, it became possible to project images from beneath the stage so that they appeared to be out in the audience. And of course, it scared the hell out of everybody. But the phantasmagoria grows up out of this idea of the image that invades the space unaccountably and suddenly and just knocks people off their chairs. So I started to enlarge this idea of the pre-Stendall effect. That is, the Stendall effect as known by artists who just want to scare the hell out of us. And I think the most famous case of this, with almost all of the working parts in clear view, is Hitchcock's 1960 film Psycho. Everyone remembers the shower scene and the fantastic music that accompanies it, Bernard Herrmann's themes, where we see everything we need to know about the Stendall effect, where Janet Leigh is taking a shower quite innocently in a cheap hotel, and the image behind her, we might imagine, is either the work of art, or we might be seeing the audience from the work of art's point of view. In any event, what happens to Janet is the same that is happening to the Stendall effect victim. Probably without the knife, but it feels just as bad. So I wanted to go back and model this Pilgrim effect by looking at the universal dimensions of it that were attached. And of course, the oldest ones are the theme of the katabasis, as it's known in Greek. That is the pilgrimage, such as was taken by wealthy Europeans from all over who would come to Athens, Greece, and go to Elefsina, just about 3 or 4 miles south of Athens, for the fantastic experience that had been organized and was maintained for hundreds of years by the same family. A quite unique series of theatrical events involving drugs and sex, of course, like all good artworks, and preparing people for an experience. Afterwards, everyone gave the same report, that they did not have a fear of death. So this extraordinary feature of the katabasis really gives us a kind of working model for looking at the Stendahl Syndrome all over. I'm just going to try to rush through St. Catherine's experience, St. Catherine of Siena. Sorry, on the podcast I have, it's misspelled. Siena actually only has one N. St. Catherine of Siena would visit a mural that was done by Giotto called a Navicella in the old St. Peter's. It was a mosaic work of St. Peter stepping out of a ship, invited by Jesus to have the courage to walk across water and greet him. At one point, St. Catherine experienced a kind of out-of-body experience. She said that the boat fell on her shoulders and made her collapse. I was trying to think of a good way to theorize this. This lack of order that comes about by the order of the two-dimensional work of art itself. And I was thinking about the autostereogram, which everyone knows as those flat works of art with patterned images that are positioned just so that if we look into the distance, we suddenly perceive a depth dimension that is nowhere justified in the perspectivalism of the image itself. So the account that I saw was very useful, and I'm only using this as an analogy. I don't think it's to be taken literally, but there are 3 stages to it. The first is that we look at the flat work of art, the 2 dimensions, but we're encouraged to sort of cross our visual paths so that it induces a sense that the picture plane, in fact, has advanced past itself, drawing us into a kind of infinity. This experience doesn't cancel out the original picture plane. It simply leads us into another dimension where we are literally in the depth of the 4th wall. So if we drew a 4th wall diagram around this 3-step process, we see that we're actually in a kind of space that exists in a topological way, but not in a perspectival way. So I was interested in connecting this to the Mobius strip and to other projective surfaces, such as the Klein bottle, the cross cap, especially the Mobius band, and saying that what we're having here is a transfer of the 2-dimensional projective surface to the viewer of the work of art. Those of you who know a little bit about Jorge Luis Borges, you'll know the story, The Aleph, where someone is induced to stare into space until he notices a hole that seems to be ripped in space itself. This is precisely what the Stendahl Syndrome encourages us to do, to penetrate not just into a deeper space, but to go through space itself. So I'm going to stop sharing and open up the discussion.
Don, I was just going to ask if the grand tour that people took, is this, or the Hajj, these are the kind of pilgrimages you were talking about, right?
Yes, the grand tour. The only problem there is people prepared all too well for it. But occasionally some of them would fall apart in front of a great work of art.
Or the Hajj, the Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca also.
Yeah, that's even better.
Right, right. I was going to mention that the elevator button phenomenon also occurs with traffic lights, where you see people pushing on that button repeatedly, trying to get it to change.
That's very good if you want to fall asleep.
And then the Phantasmagoria, I was also, are you familiar with Pepper's Ghost, which is another projection phenomenon in theater, in which you can have an image appear on stage? It's actually caused by smoke and mirrors. I mean, not literally, but a mirror and a projection called Pepper's Ghost. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that as well. Yeah.
Well, yeah, 3D films that you go into Cineramas and put on glasses can bring things directly in front of your eyes. That's pretty scary.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we also know that 3 seconds per cycle phenomenon can cause induce seizures in those who are predisposed. And so there are disclaimers when that occurs, with strobe lights at a certain speed can induce seizures as well in susceptible individuals. So there's usually a disclaimer in those rooms to beware that people who are predisposed to seizures can manifest them. Drew, I'm anxious about your comments.
Well, of course, the fourth wall in painting is the picture plane. And it works 2 ways, because it was a lot of fun for me to read the Oxford Dictionary of Art definition of it, in which it says that perspective recedes away from the picture plane, but trompe-l'oeil projects forward toward the viewer from it, so that there's a sort of push-pull element that the picture plane makes possible. And the sort of play with the picture plane really is visible with the tondo, starting with the Middle Ages.
Mm-hmm.
Because, of course, the tondo destabilizes the orthogonals you need to generate a sense of perspective, because they cannot be properly anchored in an oblong image field.
Yes, and the Giotto.
You generate a third kind of space, which is neither the perspectival illusion nor the sense of perspective we get in the real space that surrounds the image. But it's a sort of mediating kind of space of the tondo with the destabilized orthogonals. And therefore, the whole role of the picture plane in a tondo becomes very different.
That's a good point, because the tondo was the location of Giotto's mural.
Well, to connect to Drew's idea, and thank you to both of you for introducing to something that I think had not even been remotely known to me, this Stendahl Syndrome. So that is already a great event. Thank you very much. So yeah, when I listened, and especially around the fourth wall, I thought, yeah, okay, it has, isn't that a description or an invocation of representation, including the mechanisms of representation. But then I think Donald said at one point, no, it was not concerned with perspective, what you have been talking about, but with a topological way of creating or addressing space. And this might be a crucial difference, but I unfortunately don't really understand it. So I was wondering if you could explain it a little bit more. It seems to be, and maybe it connects to what Drew has been mentioning about the tondo, you know, about kind of, I mean, this is my suspicion here. And yeah.
Yeah, I'm really happy to do this, because I think there's a good example. Everyone knows it, I'm sure. I don't have to pull up an image, although I'm looking for one right now. Las Meninas is a good example of where topology takes over from perspectivalism. Because as you know, there's a complexity of this painting. We see Velázquez painting a painting while we're looking at him painting a painting, and we're not exactly sure what painting he's painting. We think it's a painting of someone who's standing in our place at the very point in time we're looking at the painting. In the back of the painting, we see a mirror, which seems to project, and we could hypothesize that it reflects what's on the canvas that's been turned away from us. To do this, some clever engineer has worked out the geometry of how large the images have to be. And he's shown that, in fact, if it's a large portrait, those images could make it all the way back to the mirror, in effect reproducing what Velázquez would be seeing as if the doorway were framing the king and queen of Spain. Now, because of this displaced geometry, we can't say that the picture plane is the same as the fourth wall. The picture plane is a construct, a drawing construct. You draw a line on a piece of paper, and you put a fixed viewing point, and you calculate where the perspective vanishing points are going to be, and then you structure things from there. And then whatever passes through that picture plane, this all comes from Alberti. Whatever passes through can be marked down and mapped to be the outline of what we put into the drawing or painting. I would say that the fourth wall is more of an apparatus that stands out from the picture plane, and my evidence would be, look what happens when Holbein paints the ambassadors. He occupies a space not on the picture plane, which would be impossible, but a couple of inches out from it, so that a viewer has the opportunity to kneel before the painting in a very ecclesiastical way and perceive anamorphic skull. Now, what happens at that point has a geometry to it. There's a guy named John North who's analyzed the angles and lines that are enacted by this moment of perceiving the skull. They are directly beneath the crucifix, which is half hidden on the wall. They are 27 degrees away from the horizon. That is the angle of the skull. And also the crucifix is connected to that vanishing point, that new vanishing point, which is only available in this fourth wall condition. If we turn the painting over, we find that Holbein has given us a clue about what he's up to. He's given us the date of the vernissage of the painting in a hyper accurate way. He said, I finished painting this on April 11th, 1533, 4 p.m. and we're saying, well, how did you know? Like, what went wrong? That you say, oh, I'm finished now. Let's go. The 4 p.m. tells us how high the sun was above the horizon in London on Good Friday, the day that everyone was convinced. If you were a good astrologer, you were totally convinced this was going to be the apocalypse. And so you turn the painting back over and say, my God, now I think I understand why he's showing me the skull. But of course, if it was true, that at 4:15, Holbein and everyone else would have been dead. Of course, it's one of those now is the time for the end of the world things. But it gives us an understanding of the structure of the painting as a recto and a verso, a kind of Mobius band turning around of the whole painting to construct this alternative geometry. So I'm simply looking for a projective geometry that's a more Mobius band version of what happens with the fourth wall.
Well, I must tell you, Donald, that the situation with Las Meninas is rendered even more crazy and complex by the lighting inconsistencies, because
yes,
when you look into that mirrored reflection of the king and queen, you see that on their foreheads is an oblong sort of block of light, and that indicates the directionality of the direction of the light as it's illuminating the image. But the strange thing is that that oblong sort of block of light on their foreheads is exactly the same as the one on the Infanta, their daughter, who's at the center of the painting and the center of the composition. Now, if they are indeed a reflection in that mirror, as in a sense they must be to be consistent with the general realism of the painting, then they must be facing in an opposite direction, consistent with that of the viewer, an opposite direction from where it would be possible for that light to strike them on the forehead at the same time that it strikes their daughter in the center of the composition. Yes. And I suspect that the implication there, because obviously a mirror is always in a painting a kind of reference to mimetic representation, and we see them reflected in a mirror, I suspect that it's possible that this is a way of saying that the representation, which is also recapitulated in the image of Velázquez himself in the act of painting, the representation that's contrived by the artist sort of bleeds into reality.
Right.
Drew, I love that remark. In effect, it proves the case because we know two things for sure about the painting. That Velázquez is standing in two places at once, and they're antipodal to each other. So this reversal of the light angle is a kind of tip-off to his sense of irony that when we're standing in front of the painting, we are ipso facto standing where the painter must have stood. So we have, this is a complicated mystery that we're pretty sure Velázquez knew how funny it was.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I think this, for me, it's very exciting, this development of the discussion now, because at the beginning I thought, oh, now they are talking about beauty and are using this kind of exotic syndrome, this medical condition, you know, this rare and fantastic medical condition to come back to talk about beauty. But we have not been talking about beauty for a very long time, I think, and also the fourth wall, you know, it has not been an issue in some sense. I think contemporary art has been very much about breaking down or dissolving this kind of positionality and inviting, let's say, the spectator into the space of the artwork, right? And but now I'm thinking, or just how to say, I have an inkling that maybe with what you have been addressing, and also Drew's reading of the Las Meninas, that maybe that somehow opens, let's say, a third road or third way, you know, a way between a traditional, let's say, notion of beauty connected to representation, and a contemporary condition of factuality, actuality, of unlimited or immediate, let's say, co-presence. You know, how do you feel about that?
I don't know if you know the work of Pavel Florinsky.
No, I don't think so.
He was a Russian monk and arts theorist, actually, who had some very interesting essays on reverse perspective. And he's talking about the experience of icons, where the viewer, as you know, doesn't have, in fact, you're prohibited to have an appreciative relationship to the work of art. Instead, you have an interactive association with it. And the point is transformation. The point is to learn how to do the Stendall effect on your own. So sometimes the icons actually reverse perspective, so it looks like the vanishing point is behind you instead of in front of you. This is a direct implication of, in geometry, what's called projective geometry, which emerges from the work of Pappus of Alexandria in 300 AD, where he speculates about a space that's in both internal and external to our perspectival Euclidean space.
Right. This has become especially important in anamorphism.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Dominic.
Well, I mean, I have a few. One is a bit closer to what just happened with your fascinating exchange, which is relating to the idea of a perspective as a device, but the device which in fact grows onto the idea of a control. How we maintain the syndrome, the Stendall syndrome in terms of avoiding it, because what I was just thinking was this the notion of a photography in terms of the Japanese tourists, whether we can imagine a photography. Speaking of the term capture, we capture pictures, but in fact maybe the idea is to keep the syndrome, the Stendall syndrome, in a captive state. Meaning that we somehow sort of try to secure ourselves in front of it, because if you think about the simple process of photography, I would consider that within especially the present situation, when the photographs are being made in terms of the millions per second, you could consider photography more of a capture of an image, but more of a capture in terms of the situation that we are really not want to get involved too much. So I thought about the Japanese tourists who capture the images because they are too beautiful. So the only way to actually resist the beauty is to make a photograph. Yeah. So the photograph becomes more of a performative function that allows us somehow not to get too much involved within a scene or within the sort of experience of the pure beauty or the phenomena that we facing. So that's why we use the photograph actually to capture and to remain in control within the image that otherwise would have become would have affect us within a possible the Stendall Syndrome. I don't know, what would you say on this? Because I remember
the first time I went to Venice, like every good tourist, I climbed the steps of the Campidoglio to the top, and when I was there emerged immediately from the steps a Japanese tourist with a camera who never looked at the view. He instantly put the camera to his face and only saw the view from through the lens, through the camera, and he snapped it and went back down the steps. So he never saw the view with his own eyes.
And probably he will never look at those photographs again, because if you look at those photographs you make, this is another question.
They'll be on Instagram, viewable by millions of viewers.
Yes, but yeah.
We're considering that he's doing the right thing.
So, Dominic, I was very interested in your comments about control, because in terms of the project we did in Switzerland, that was your description about your work about being in control and not in control as related to your skiing. Not sure if you remember that quote at all. And I'll also be interested in your perspectives on your work in which you have projections onto a painting. So I think from a perspectival standpoint, that would be interesting to discuss as well.
Well, I mean, it is related to the process of the reverse perspective. I would say that would involve the viewer.
Yes.
Into the image.
Yeah. So could you describe it for the other people who may not be familiar with that work?
What I can say is, I mean, I think the best thing would be to refer to those few very important questions that were asked by Ulrich in the catalog for my show in Gdańsk, because we were actually discussing that problem in terms of the importance of the surface. Mm-hmm. I think if you think about the surface, it's also a question of a control or a certain type of filter that we will introduce between the viewer and the sort of the illusion. And I think that this is something which is important for me, also in terms of the idea that somehow can relate to the subject, which is the notion of this psychological phenomena that you described, and I think it relates to the question of the focusing attention, or I mean, you can also refer to the theory of modern noun that draws onto the question of the impulse, the impulse of the image that is not necessarily being I would say put in the equilibrium with the other impulses. So we're facing the image, but for example, I never use the sound in my work because it becomes immersive. Also, it distracts the focus of attention on the different impulses. So the only way to avoid the immersive notion of the image is to create the surface, or to expose the surface, which is a complete reverse to the cinematic phenomenon of being drawn into, but at the same time drawn by forgetting about our own physicality, which is included within my work very strongly, because as long as I expose the surface, I also expose the viewer, and without the surface there is no viewer. Without the physical feeling of a viewer, there's no sense of surface. So I think this is something which I would say can somehow relate to this issue of a control, I would say. That we still, in terms of the perspective of a camera, this is still a question, as Donald mentioned, of the apparatuses which helps us to remain within a control. So the control which I relocate into the viewer, I think it's important. How much we can relocate it. Versus the representations which actually completely kidnap the viewer, and they took over, and they do not allow the viewer its physical feeling of a physical presence, which I think may somehow related to the way how we feel and how we are conscious in front of the image. Just a short comment, but yeah.
Well, it's very, very interesting and very pertinent, I think, to this exchange here, and I think it should be underlined your use of the idea of the surface, because what you call surface now is in some sort of way the same as the picture plane, right? This device that is needed, this membrane, as I think Panofsky called it, yeah. It's needed to implement representation, but it's exactly not the picture plane. It's a. I mean, this is so interesting to me that there's not a in what you have been describing, and also what was the content of the talk of Donald and of Koan. There's not a how to say, a radical digression from, let's say, traditional setups and devices and apparatuses, but it's a sort of contamination or an inversion or a twisting or etc., etc. And this, I think, is a very interesting, and I think also sort of difficult really to locate and to verbalize positionality of contemporary work, you know. Because it accepts to, as the anamorphic, as the Holbein thing, it accepts to work with ambiguities, and with it kind of messes up any ideas of radicality, and at least, you know, a sort of radicality that is connected to ideas of purity and unidimensionality. So that's what I find very interesting about your intervention here, Dominic. The surface, the idea of the surface, and also what the syndrome, you know, that allows to talk about beauty again.
There's also this Drew voice. Please, thank you.
I hope this is better.
Much better.
I thought when I first saw those works, they were sort of double assault on the aspiration to self-referentiality of minimalism, because you have what appears at first to be a minimalist painting, but it has a surface that not only draws attention to the picture plane, but also to the hand of the artist as a reference. And then on this, you get a second system of illusion of reference and picture plane with the projection, which reestablishes another picture plane, and which also refers to something very specific. So I thought of it as a sort of double assault on this aspiration to self-referentiality of minimalism.
There is also something which I would say that may be interesting also as a kind of a question from the crowd. I hope the crowd will be more active, but my question, as I imagine myself now as a part of this crowd, would be the obvious question about interactivity. Because if you describe the syndrome, the Stendall syndrome, of course it deals with the idea of interactivity, and the way how we think, I would say, about contemporary interactivity. It's not necessarily, I mean, to use I think Zizek term, the interpassivity. That what does it really mean? I mean, the Holbein's painting is definitely interactive because it forces us to play with an image and kind of it mobilizes us, but it doesn't really work in the way how computer games work now, that we have to be responsive to the impulse, so we become marionettes of the software rather than we are the protagonists of the process. So I think this is really interesting for me in terms of the whole idea of the relation in terms of experiencing certain phenomenon in art, which you describe also as in the psychological effect of the Stendall Syndrome, the idea of interactivity, and how we can redefine the interactivity in the contemporary the condition of the visual culture, whether I would say, or I would dare to say, that most of the so-called interactive works of art, in fact, they are interpassive.
Well, I must say, although I never experienced Stendall Syndrome, I can easily remember the times when I was most impressed looking at a work of art. And what I learned from that experience was that, like any good joke, the build-up is a big part of the impact, because the punchline might not be that funny, but the build-up to it is what ensures that climax. Once, when I was 10 years old, I got to see the Sistine ceiling before it was cleaned.
Yeah.
And I also got to see, when I was in London visiting the National Gallery, the Leonardo's cartoon of the Virgin and Infinite Christ with John the Baptist and Saint Anne. And I must say that a third very memorable experience to me was to see Guernica of Picasso in New York, when it was still in New York. And in all these three cases, the walk up to the preparatory walk up, which in the case of the Sistine ceiling is also unforgettable, because you get the whole Piazza San Pietro and the great cupola of the basilica, and the preparatory entrance where the light becomes diminished very gradually. In Trafalgar Square, there was a similar kind of preparatory walk that led to the effect of this. And in New York, I would say, also because of the great skyline visible just outside, and the sense of anticipation built up by the crowds who only had come there to see those works, and which became electrifying as you got closer and closer to the works themselves. But I was very lucky, I suppose, because I did not collapse.
Drew, I was just looking at Walter Benjamin's article, the one, of course, that everyone knows and uses in class, where he discusses the aura of the work of art. And he introduces the issue that the work of art begins with the religious experience that includes the procession to the work of art. So in effect, he gives us a kind of schematic diagram, which is exactly what you described. I remember accidentally seeing Guernica when the Museum of Modern Art was the old building, and you could slip up the back stairs behind the ticket booth. And I went up the back stairs thinking I would get the jump on the other tourist, and I had forgotten that Guernica was at the top of the stairs.
Yeah.
You know, you're a little bit exhausted. It's a steep run, and you get to the top and you look at the Guernica, you can't avoid it.
Yeah.
And it knocks you off your feet.
Yeah.
So part of it is you're not anticipating it, but you're preparing for it unconsciously. And then when you get to it, damn it, you just fall apart. So I was rethinking Benjamin's argument here, and I think he really has something with the aura. But where I disagree with him is where he says that reproduction has made it impossible to continue this tradition of pilgrimage. I think we have other ways of doing it, as Dominique has demonstrated.
I didn't know, Drew, that we were sharing the same pilgrimages. But I do really think that this is something really important, that the how we can oppose the accessibility in terms of the contact with the work of art. Because, for example, for me, and a perfect example is the dia beacon. When you really literally need to spend some time and take a train and go. So this preparatory, in my memory, this preparatory process, which is a pilgrimage, becomes the essence of the experience.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm a little bit skeptical.
Great.
I'm a little bit skeptical. I don't know. Maybe that's a little bit somehow too easy, or not really pertinent to overuse this metaphor of the pilgrimage. I don't know if I mean, it sounds almost like going back to some sort of like innocent state, you know. I mean, Drew is mentioning something he experienced at the age of 10. So, you know, I mean, this kind of innocence, and it also sounds quite reactionary. And
I assure you that when I was 10, I was guilty.
So I would propose to try to somehow develop different models, you know, and not just to adopt a let's say a historical and in some sort of way outdated model. Right. It would sound really terrible if we were saying, okay, let's recreate situations of this sublime experience, you know, this kind of veneration and admiration, etc., etc. And mentioning Benjamin, I mean, he is super critical of that, you know. Don't. I mean, he connects it to the reality of fascism. Let's not forget that. You know, and there we are, Dominic, in some sort of way, arriving probably at a different type of control, you know, and of loss of, you know, losing your mind, losing your body, loss of any kind of senses, you know, and this cannot be what you want, I'm sure. I mean, I think we have to find different models, not totally different, but maybe more ambiguous models, you know. This is what I wanted to say also earlier.
Just to throw this in quickly, I think Maurice Halbwachs has already given us a good alternative to the romanticized idea of the pilgrimage. Because in one of the same books where he's talking about the experience of pilgrimage, he talks about jazz composition and improv, where there seems to be a synchronicity that arises out of the improbable conditions of one musician does not know what the other musician is going to do. So in unbelievably different circumstances, I think you can have the same structure. Just as, you know, my experience of Guernica came when I was much older than Drew. So, and I wasn't looking for it either.
There's one thing I was wondering about, that we didn't really make a decision between the singular experience and the crowd experience, because I think Ulrich just draw on this sort of pretty, I would say, really important and crucial notion of a fascism that, you know, that deals with the group experience, that deals with the sort of like from Canetti, the idea of a discharge when you lose yourself within a crowd. And I'm just thinking, what do you think about these differences in terms of this phenomenon of the stance, in terms of the difference between the singular experience, the personal one, and the crowd experience? How does it relate to that?
Yeah, it sounds. I cannot say anything, but it's maybe promising. I mean, the idea of the pilgrimage is definitely connected to a crowd, right? I mean, isn't it not? Is it not? You're on the St. Jacob's path, you know, and
the crowd experience makes it more electrifying.
Yeah, and also the Japanese tourists, you know, before now we're talking in the same racist way about the Chinese tourists, you know, and you know, it's also a crowd experience, of course. It's difficult, I think, Dominic. It sounds interesting but difficult. I mean, where's where do you draw the border between the crowd and the solitary?
Having lived in China for years, I can say that everything in China is a crowd experience.
Right.
But wait, what's happening now in this talk, in this our gathering? Is this schizophrenic situation of the singular experience and being in a crowd altogether?
Well, I think this is what Donald talked about with the jazz example, right? I think this was really very interesting and helpful in some sort of way, you know. And I think it's also a way out of the this dialectics of crowd and the singular or the individual, you know. It's not even a synthesis, you know. That's so interesting and good about what you have been saying, I think, Donald. It's something different, right? It's something almost unclassifiable. I mean, I'm sure it has been theorized but it tends to be an example of something unclassifiable, and that is maybe currently the most interesting. You know, this getting away from classifications, and then I can even like minimalism, Drew. You know, I mean, even that is not a way to say, okay, now we have finally something, you know, that releases us from the spell of minimalism. You know, no, to use everything and to be more involved with positionality, as I think Donald explained when he explained to me the ideas of topography. I think that is really a and that also gives the opportunity to individual, even idiosyncratic works that do not disconnect from let's say the audience, or or not disconnect from a common and shared experience.
Don, did you have any comments on mass hysteria? Because it seems to be something that would be relevant to the discussion here.
Yeah, but hysteria is better in crowds. But
yeah,
the deflation of one's ecstasy is easily brought on by fellow tourists who are not having the same degree of experience you're having. But if a group is carried forward by the right, if it's managed by the right people. And this is why I'm so fascinated with the Eleusinian Mysteries, is that it ran for so many years, the longest running show in history. And it involved the same plot, the same roles, basically the same scenario for 200 or 300 years. And the remarkable thing about it was everyone who came out of it had exactly the same account that they were freed of the fear of death. They thought they got their money's worth. It cost a lot of money. And a lot of stage tricks were used. I went with a group a couple of summers ago, and there's a bridge where the pilgrims had to pass over the bridge, and there were people paid to hide under the bridge and yell insults to the pilgrims, and they would find out personal details, scandalous secrets that they didn't know that were designed to embarrass the pilgrims. So it brought everyone down to the same state of humiliation. And so they were all disconcerted as they arrived to the site. This was about, I'd say, a quarter of a mile outside of Eleusis proper. So by the time they got there, they were shaken up by something they didn't expect. And it was pretty certain that it was staged. But then this whole thing about the secrecy, I'm sure you know about the fact that only one person dared to give away any slight detail, and he was persecuted. I don't know if they killed him, but he was certainly taken to court for it. And even I think Euripides, I may have the wrong playwright here, but somebody put some details of the mysteries into one of his plays, and he was taken to court. This is sort of like Mozart, putting too much masonry into the magic flute. But the point of these things is that they work. They're highly effective. They're not based on anybody's opinion. You go in, you pay your money, and you get your full value out of it. And the value is profound. If you can say that not fearing death anymore is profound, and I take it to be that's the apex of the experience of a work of art.
Mm-hmm. I was just wondering about crowd behavior, because it's being studied from a biological and even olfactory component, like pheromonal influences between individuals in a crowd.
There used to be Smellorama in movie theater.
I remember that. But, there's studies about starling, how the starlings group or groups, schools of fish, and how they key off of each other, not the group itself, but the individual next to it. And so I think there's a lot of, rich, research to be done there. But the pheromonal influences, I think, are significant as well. I work with an olfactory DJ in Amsterdam who basically says he can change the mood of the crowd by wafting certain fragrances during the dance. So I think there is something there. The other subject I want to introduce, which is a bit of a segue, is the Dominic, you mentioned entertainment or gaming phenomenon, is augmented reality, in which there is this layering, a visual layering, literally a visual layering onto an image that's moderated or modulated by a screen, right? So you're looking at a phone of the reality of the lens taking in the landscape over which is superimposed text or other things. I was wondering if anyone had any comments about that layering effect from the aspect of, the picture plane, perspective, etc. Anyway, a topic for discussion, further investigation in terms of that, yeah. But I'd like that, you're familiar also with the work of, I'm forgetting his name now that I mentioned it, the person who painted a painting of a woman painting a car crash. What's his name?
J.G. Ballard? No.
No.
Oh, that's not the painter.
No. He also did The Innocent Eye. Oh, Mark Tansey. That's what I'm speaking of. Mark Tansey's work. My favorite work of his, when I talk about acculturation and the effects of culture on perception and artwork, is called The Innocent Eye, in which a bunch of banker-looking people are unveiling a painting to be analyzed by an expert. The expert that's brought in is a cow looking at pictures of a painting of cows. So, The other image I introduced also, which is a movie called The Gods Must Be Crazy. Do you remember that movie at all? Yeah, in which natives find the Coke bottle and don't know what to do with it. So the mission is to go to the end of the earth and and toss it into the abyss. Anyhow, I digress. But those are images I usually use when I talk about aspects of culture. There's also a Thai artist whose name I cannot pronounce right now, but she represented Thailand in the one of the Venice Biennales. But she did videos of villagers who are positioned in front of iconic works, say by Jeff Koons or Cindy Sherman. And of course, the language that they're using has to do with, you know, the ordinariness of the clothing or the clumsiness of the performer. You know, totally a different context. So presenting, you know, these works of art in front of villagers who don't have any kind of experience, I think is a really interesting perspective as well in terms of culture. And let's see. The last thing, not the last thing, but one thing I want to remark, Ulrich, you mentioned, you know, the Japanese being, you know, kind of classified under this, not racist, but as, you know, a category. I'm wondering, Dominic, about your comment about the Japanese photographers. So I was wondering if there is something about the Japanese culture, or maybe just because they travel a lot or experience a lot of different cultures, you know, what it is about Japanese culture that might be, you know, a propensity for developing these syndromes. Just another thought. We know that the Japanese culture is quite, well, stereotyped as being inscrutable, right? There are different layers in terms of meaning in Japanese culture.
Well, this is a very, very complex question, and I think I don't feel like an expert, except you know, around the month in total I spend in Japan, installing my exhibitions. On the one conversation when I was asked about during the interview about my work, which is this YOLO V, that's a double image with the projected figure of a visitor that is in delay. I was asked about from the crowd about the possible dangers of the technological developments, and I think, well, this is something really fascinating that with the Japanese culture, that it's so coherent within the development. It doesn't oppose it. On contrary, it goes all together with the sort of the development of a technical capacity, and I think it has a lot to do with the culture of ghosts. Ghost as a very much sort of a present, speaking of also the religious aspect of a Japanese culture, that the idea of ghost is something much more broader than in the European culture. So, well, my response to that was that the only thing I'm afraid is would be that our reproductions we will have the better resolution than ourselves. Meaning that the ghosts will really take over because they will be more accurate and more precise and more within a better resolution than the actual the original. So this place is discussion of also of the augmented reality in a different level, because when you think about the contemporary tools that we've been given, this all goes to that direction pretty straightforward, that our reproductions soon will be really much more accurate than what we are or who we are now. Speaking of the students who like yesterday, they provided me some examples of the work using the deep fake, and the deep fake is already not just an invention of a super technological industries that are using a sort of a very exclusive and high-tech post-production programs, but the deep fake is just a normal tool to reshape and refigure yourself for the purpose of Instagram or Facebook. That's really crazy. I mean, yesterday I used his device and I was Rambo in the film with my face just taken by a little selfie, and suddenly I was literally included within the scene of me showing off his enormous muscles and fighting with the crowd of enemies, and it was very convincing. That's what I can say. Going back to Japanese culture, which I would say is a culture which in fact is very much prophetic because of its, I would say, because of the social structure, that the social group mechanism is the entity much stronger than in the European one, that we are individuals. Mm-hmm. So it's always a little bit forward, and I think they do not have a problem with that. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if this is an any kind of an answer, but this is just a bunch of reflections that I had speaking of the differences. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I would say that the crowd experience is also something very different. Mm-hmm. Something which actually places you in a position of being ghosts, because walking along the streets of Osaka, I was never really noticed. I was never identified as a stranger. I was a ghost. I was totally transparent, and I think this is one of the most phenomenal experiences. Speaking of Japan, I do not have any experiences with other cultures of East, but with Japan, you may literally feel like you're a complete ghost. You do not exist physically. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think it could be a protective mechanism as well. It is said that,
of course, absolutely, yeah. Because I think. Yeah, because I think what's really interesting for me in our conversation is the idea of a protective mechanism.
Right.
How using all aspects, the cultural aspects, and following the optical aspects, we are destined still to use those the elements as a protective element. So as art is also, I would say, the way how we create the perspective as a sort of an agreement to maintain the control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. They say if a chambermaid comes into a hotel room and finds the occupant undressed or in a compromising position, if that chamber person ignores that and just pretends like it doesn't exist, if that person was a ghost, then the situation is okay.
Also, I mean, speaking of this, what was really interesting for me was a bunraku theater.
Right.
Because in bunraku, in fact, the only person who is allowed to show the face is the most experienced puppeteer who shows his indifference. So as long as you're completely neutral and completely indifferent on stage, then you can show your face. Mm-hmm. Without any emotions on it. Others, they have to cover themselves with hoods to struggle with the puppet, which is this creature which is being put to life because of the struggle rather than because of the agreement. They fight to actually make it move. It's a struggle between two puppeteers operating one puppet. So those ones who are indifferent enough, they are allowed, to show the face. Those ones who are not experienced enough and who actually express the emotions, they have to be covered.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Dominic, did you run into stories about ghosts after the tsunami?
No, I'm not really with you now, Donald. Sorry. Ghost after
the tsunami in northern Japan.
Yes.
You were probably too far away. But there were tons of reports that started to come in from very ordinary people, people who had no belief in ghosts or any religious affiliations, that they would run into ghosts after the tsunami, and so many people were killed. And the problem was one of overcrowding. They didn't see the ghosts as alarming in themselves, but the fact that there were too many of them and they would appear in unsocializable situations. So I was, and they had to take action to get rid of the ghost. One was a dog that revisited the family, and the family said, "Oh, we haven't given the dog a proper burial. That's why he's always bothering us." So they had to find some way of at least pretending that they had found the dog and bury him. This idea of disappearance, the only thing I know about Japanese culture is it's highly sensitive to crowding and over proximity, which you would think they maintain normal distance. But of course, you know, Japanese are very good at not maintaining proper distance. They can pack into all kinds of spaces very easily. And it's only when you turn around and address them that they immediately back away and become very polite again. But it made me think of the derogatory term in Chinese. If you visit places where they speak Cantonese, they call you guailo, which means white ghost.
Is that true, Drew? Is this what would you say, Drew? You're the expert.
Well, it's very often, there are many terms in Chinese for just foreigners that involve the word ghost, like Yangguizi is foreign ghost, which is sometimes translated as foreign devil.
Right.
Waiguagui, foreign ghost. But I most often never got that. I just got the more anatomical big nose.
Or round eye.
Which in my case is very true.
Bravo.
Yes. The other terms would be round eye and milk drinker.
The other thing which I was going to ask Donald about the core of our meeting here and the Stendahl Syndrome would be again very simple question, but how would you recognize our cultural background in terms of something which allows us or forbids us or preserve us from getting into such an emotional state? Speaking of, like, you know, all those stories about people crying in front of the Rothko painting. Do you think you really need to be innocent, or you really need to be not? The question of experience and sort of sensory experience, how does it apply to our cultural background or the way how we perceive certain imagery from the perspective which is already somehow complemented, but where we from, what we know?
Kōan probably has a better answer. I go back to Hitchcock, because Hitchcock was a master of knowing that people wanted discomfort, and they sought out situations where they knew they could be guaranteed of some degree of personal safety, but nonetheless experience horror, fright, all of the things that we would count as uncomfortable. But this seems to be just an ancient phenomenon. I mean, Odysseus has himself bound to the mast so he can hear the sirens, and clearly this is he knows, he's been told that the sirens will drive you crazy. Probably this is the earliest recorded account of the Stendall Syndrome, that the music is so sweet it's going to knock you off your boat or make your head explode. He wants to hear it anyway. And I think it's quite interesting that we desire for this confrontation. You know, Kant's third critique on judgment goes into this desire for danger in the sublime. That we structure a space in which we have access to something horrible, something frightening, potentially harmful to us, and yet we want to perceive it. So this sublime, I think the way Kant handles it in contrast to beauty, in effect, he suggests that what happens in the Stendall effect with beauty is that the beautiful becomes the sublime. And this is the very thing that converts us to a physiological collapse. But the fact that it's been recognized for so many centuries absolutely fascinates me. So it does indicate that there's something structural about our desire in relation to the aura of the work of art and the things that we have learned to do around it as anticipatory. That makes me think we really need to concern ourselves with this idea of the buffer that can suddenly give way without any warning, and have us pass out in front of a work of art.
Thank you.
I mean, there literally is no other way to explain it than people desire this kind of death.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, is it reflected also in fairy tales, in which you have these horrendous, horrendous beheadings and burnings and witches and evil things, in terms of confronting? You know, kids always want to hear the scary parts, right?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Of course,
And maybe
went through the Napoleonic campaigns and didn't have that problem until he saw a work of art.
Yeah, but the huge attraction of horror films, right? I'm told that it's the easiest genre to get into because it's the most popular as well, and the most consumed genre. Yeah. Just as an aside, growing up in Hawaii, we had access to many different culture movies. So Sunday was Japanese night, and we were very fond of going to see the obake, which is the ghost in Japanese movies. I think the Japanese and Chinese horror films or obake films were the most frightening. And even now, I think The Ring, which is out of Japan, leads the horror genre in terms of, you know, scare on the scare scale, the most horrific. I'm not sure if you've seen The Ring, but I think it's consistently ranked the most horrible. Interesting that it came out of Japan as well. Just in terms of, go ahead.
Would you agree that the genre of horror to be effective requires the perfect rational environment, meaning that to make the jolt, to create this heart beating sort of explosion, you need the total tranquility, or you need a situation which is perfectly rational, normal. Then when this is the major difference between the fairy tale and the horror. Then the horror is perfectly rational until this unrational phenomena appears, and then we start to question everything. With the fairy tales, it's like, well, nobody questions the existence of dragons and witches. They are part of the environment. It's just a question to fight with them, or to conquer them, or to beat them up. But there's nothing irrational in terms of fairy tale. If you think about the existence of a dragon or a troll or the other creature,
right? Yeah. Yeah.
Which I think that this refers very strongly now in the present situation in Poland, when I would say that it is a horror, but everybody thinks that we're in fairy tale, meaning that nobody questions the existence of dragons and other strange creature on the political stage.
Yeah. I was just going to say, in terms of the cinematic experience, though, the soundtrack is very, very important as well. That, you know, I don't think people acknowledge the way that the soundtrack can heighten one's anxiety or anticipation of the horror to come. You know?
Absolutely.
And also, some of the more scary ones are those that don't have a physical, you know, embodiment of horror. It's like the thing that you don't see, right? The thing that does not come on screen, you know.
Well, there's the rule of the horror movie is you always film the monster from the point of view of the monster. That is, you don't show the monster. Dominique, what you said really interested me, because I've heard from magicians who work close-up magician acts, is that if they find out that there's anyone in the audience who believes in magic, they get rid of them.
Koan, you just disappeared in this sort of Eve Klein blue. I don't know if this is the effect of what Donald just said.
No, it's the effect of coffee. I'll be right back.
But also, I was thinking of David Lynch, who's the master of creating the normal condition out of which the abnormal appears as a kind of monstrous
I agree, yes.
emergence. The beginning of so many of his films began very ordinary, very mundane, and then suddenly something horrible emerges. Blue Velvet. The father is watering the lawn and falls down, and that's not enough. We go into the grass and see the bugs, and then we go into the dirt and see more bugs and worms. And it's absolutely horrifying.
The discovery of the ear.
The ear, yes. Oh, what a rascal!
But this is the ability of the cinema to create a fear. How would you imagine the work of art in a gallery that could provide us a similar sensation? I don't know, Ulrich, if anything comes to your mind. That I go to the gallery and I just like scare the shit out of me.
Well, I get scared if I'm going to a museum for the first time and I know there's going to be a Jeff Koons there.
Although I think if you would agree with me that there is a certain aspect of contemporary art which may provide such a sensation, but it goes more into the potential threat or the physical direct contact with our. It's like I never dared to go into the piece of work of Teresa Nargoles, for example. With the contaminated the air from the Mexican morgues, you somehow feel threatened, or you take a risk. Where is this element of a risk that you can compare or create a certain, I would say, the parallel between that and what happens to us when we watch a horror movie? I don't know. It's just another question, but
yeah. Are people familiar with that work that Dominic described? So the Mexican artist basically took the washings of a morgue and aerosolized it in a room. So in order to experience it, you had to sign a waiver recognizing that you were inhaling, possible biological components in the aerosol.
So yes, I wouldn't dare to go, but I found it interesting as a concept.
Yeah.
Well, usually I think the art that we encounter there, it's usually not. I mean, it intends not to be this kind of illusionary or illusion machine, like a horror movie.
Yes.
I mean, much of the let's say justification of art in the contemporary is about exactly
The opposite. The opposite?
What? The opposite, yeah, yes, like cutting these ties, you know, that tie you to this focus on all these things that may induce a completely unavoidable feeling or notion or so, you know. Well, I mean, there are some artists like, what is this Icelandic, what's his name?
Olafur Eliasson?
Yes, exactly. I think he is somebody who likes to maybe like Margolis, I don't know, maybe not, but he would be somebody who would like to immerse you in a like total experience, you know. Yeah. But I mean, usually, at least the art that probably I would be interested in would cut these ties or expose these ties, you know, and not to, yeah. So I think contemporary art doesn't really have an access to this overwhelming, to the creation of these overwhelming feelings, Dominic, like of horror. So,
hello, Yehuda. Yes. Well, how about Gregor Schneider? So the work of art, the trap.
Yeah, I don't know.
Do we need the traps in our experience?
Dominic, I'm not familiar with the work. Can you describe Gregor's work?
Well, Gregor Schneider, he has made these, he has created these spaces that somehow look like completely ordinary spaces. You enter into another space, and then you may pass through a completely dark space, and you feel there may be a person somewhere there or so. So maybe it has a potential to induce fear or feeling of being debased or so. But even Dominic, I would say, even in Gregor Schneider's work, this is not a like a first level intention of the work. You know, if there is something like this feeling of being debased or fearful or of losing your orientation, this, I think, is used within a, let's say, larger tableau. You know, it's not just this experience, I would say. Yeah.
Well, I think, Ulrich, what you're saying is certainly true of the Todesräume, which is the big installation he's just made for West Den Haag. And it does have these fearful moments. The building that the museum occupies formerly was the American Embassy.
Right.
And the spaces are reassigned, so it has names on the door like interrogation room. And when you go in, you might find some very unexpected things. But as you say, these feelings are secondary to the overall strategy of the work.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say that's a signature of contemporary art. I would even say, right? I mean, there's nothing. I mean, it doesn't come to my mind. Maybe we can take it as a homework and share next time. But nothing comes to my mind that would be considered interesting or, you know, like decent or so, that would work on this primary level of inducing something like horror or fear or even huge joy, you know. I mean, yeah.
But are they works of art that can make you feel uncomfortable in terms of the suddenly you feel uncomfortable with yourself because you start to accuse yourself of the things that you would not like to be? This is like this is amazing photograph of Duane. Oh, kill me, Duane. The photograph of Baltus, of Baltazar Klosowski, you know, the painter. Whether you have his Japanese wife and the photo of it's his portrait. When the photo is showing the mirror, and in the mirror you see the eye of Baltus who is turned backwards. So you can just see the eye, and the eye is the judging eye, in fact, because as you all know, all of his paintings are these little naked girls. So, and they put the viewer in this uncomfortable situation of, on the one hand, getting completely seduced by the quality of the image, but on the other hand, putting yourself in a position of almost a pedophiliac, which you would.
Yes, and probably, I don't know this photograph, but probably also making you watch yourself in this position of the voyeur, of the pedophiliac, etc., etc. You know, I think the way you're describing this photograph, it almost takes us back to an earlier description of Las Meninas, which also, I mean, this is the interesting thing. Yes, there's probably a lot of artworks, and maybe the best that do imply the or integrate or challenge the viewer in this way or another way, and don't let you, you know, don't just accord to this place of the untouched viewer, right? But it would not be. I don't think it would be the this condition of total fascination. Usually not. I wouldn't find it interesting either. At least not in content. Maybe in the movie theater, yes, but not in the exhibition hall. You know. Yeah. Or in the fairground, right, in Coney Island or so, you're fascinated by being taken down and experiencing this near-death experience and all of that. But I don't think it's the field of art. No, I don't think so. Right.
I think people seek it more in illegal narcotics.
Yeah, right.
Yehuda.
Yes, right.
I remember because Yehuda arrived and he's in the car for the moment. I was just tempted to go back to our conversation with Yehuda about the horizontal staircase, which was quite some time ago. But I thought that was interesting. That's also an interesting aspect of what you were just saying about the idea of a pilgrimage from the architectural point of view. And this horizontal staircase it's a mechanism to actually slow you down when you approach the work of art. So I do believe that best museums like Chiasma, for example, by Stephen Hall, they're perfect design if they are designed not to not for the easy accessibility, but something on contrary, to slow you down for the experience, to allow you to, for example, like MoMA in New York, for me, is too accessible. You just go and you confront the work of art. So it's just maybe going back to the conversation about the distance and the integral part of the pilgrimage as kind of existing within the work of art. But I think it's an interesting problem, how we can design the spaces that are made to slow us down, to actually not allow us for this contact in a direct and accessible way. But I don't know, Yehuda is here, but I'm not sure if he can respond somehow to that.
I see an indication that Yehuda's microphone is on mute.
Right.
There's the eye that you were talking about.
Yeah.
Well, of course, Dominic, the work of Gregor Schneider, whom we have just mentioned, is a wonderful example of where the artist doesn't leave it to the architect, you know, doesn't leave it to the institution, etc. And I remember Drew's lecture some time ago in this case, the artist completely takes over control of speed and accessibility and speed of the viewer and all of that, right? I mean, this is an example where the architect is completely cut out. And another example, architectural one, is maybe Caesar, who uses these ramps that are never allow you a frontal access, but always a lateral access. I mean, that's a sort of like another example, maybe, for what you are looking for. I'm personally sort of skeptical about these, like, architectural, call it solutions or propositions, because they will be okay for this type of work of art, but not okay for another type of work of art, you know. So I think there's and once again, following I think some indications of Drew the other time, there is at least in some sectors of art making, there's a big desire to control these situations yourself, you know, and not to expect, let's say, society or architecture or institution offer the perfect environment.
I think certainly we're no longer in the period of the white cube, that this has been superseded, that the white cube was a sort of self-referential space to show self-referential art, and that now for a very long time art has been referential. So now the architects are making inherently referential spaces to show them.
But are they? Do you think that it's not only work of art, but also conditions that may affect the viewer in such emotional response to the work of art? I mean, do we need do you think it is somehow connected? Because experiencing Rothko, I would say, is a completely different experiencing if there would be different light. It's a low level of light.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a dark space. It's not a white cube. It's something in between.
Yeah.
Just wondering about that specific type of condition which would emotionally draw us, or which would affect on our emotions in such way as the Rothko paintings do, as we know.
Well, I personally thought it was terrible, this Johnson thing. I thought architecturally it was terrible, and also ideologically it was terrible. I mean, it was in some way faulting the paintings, you know, because the paintings were made as paintings and not as environmental features, you know, of this kind of hoo-hoo space, you know, where they say, okay, you give up all your your ideas and your smartness and your shoes, etc., and you immerse yourself into this sauna of dimmed space or something. You know, I think it's terrible. It's really it's catastrophic.
Great.
I don't know. In that sense, I personally don't have a lot of expectation in architecture. You know, I think it doesn't have a chance other than being wrong. But I'm sorry, but it's maybe idiotic to say that. But yeah. Look at what is being planned for Berlin here. You know, this Herzog de Meuron. I mean,
I tend to agree with you, Ulrich. Have you been to Heumbrich outside of Dusseldorf?
Yes.
What's your opinion?
Terrible. It's an artist, Herich, who has made interesting, like strange sort of minimalistic work using a cardboard, etc., etc. It was fantastic. It was very eremitic. You know, it was independent of the American, this powerhouse kind of art, etc. And then he transforms it into these brick-built things, you know, and pavilions or something, you know, and with terrible art. I don't know. I find it, even that, I mean, all these things, Dominic, that are designed to condition you or me. I mean, if you go to Versailles, you say, oh, I'm going here, I'm going to be conditioned, you know, and I feel like this ambassador or somebody who is conditioned to, you know, to revere the king or whatever it is. This is okay, of course. But if you feel now in our day and age that there is somebody who tries to condition you for the better, probably, I mean, you immediately get skeptical. I do. Yeah, you want to get out of that immediately. I mean, this is wrong. This conditioning, this educational, this kind of bettering or, you know, ideology. I think it's really very, very problematic. I don't know if there's alternatives, but I find it, you know, I find it really problematic.
I agree.
That's a great remark, Ulrich. Forced healing. We
exactly, forced healing, and even the idea of healing. You know, I was a little bit afraid, but also hoping that you, Koan, would you know, raise the idea of healing connected to art, because you hear it sometimes, you know, and I mean, maybe another talk, Dominic. I think it would be a great subject for a talk. The idea of healing connected to art, you know. Which would, I mean, which would take us to these ideas of purpose, you know. Now it's shifting away from the purposeful creation of the apparatus to the purpose of the work of art, right? And I think that's a huge and important point of discussion contemporarily.
No, I agree. It would be a subject for an entire different talk.
Yeah,
related but different talk. Yeah.
Yes,
perhaps
I would appreciate it. Find somebody, Dominic, who can bring up or invite Koan again, you know, with a different hat.
Sure.
I think I have all the company, which is just right for the discussion.
Okay.
Especially now, I think it's a very contemporary.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Sure. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It would be interesting to explore the other part of healing as well. Spells.
Okay.
The dark side of healing, right? We don't just look at the light side. Yeah.
Right.
There's a dark side of medicine as well, as you know.
Well, actually, in his lecture, David Elliott, he raised, I think, if I remember correctly, the idea of connecting art to healing. So we had somebody already who was close, you know. I think it's a huge topic. It's very, very, how to say, pertinent contemporarily.
Yeah.
WhatsApp audio.
Well, I'm always mystified by our ideas of health. And Gadamer had a book on it that was entirely unsatisfactory for me. The idea of health, of course, presumes that somehow you've postponed death for a little bit longer. Most cultures go in the opposite direction and say coming to terms with
WhatsApp audio.
Definitely not me.
Sorry.
Persistent. And of course, Freud was famous for saying that the only cure for life was death. And I know a lot of us don't consider death as a cure, or we're not happy with that result, but we do seem to be happy with rehearsals of death. And I think rehearsals somehow escape the categories where we're allowed a certain distance with a work of art, or even allowed the luxury of modeling or accounting for or representing what's happening to us. I think that kind of exposure is quite interesting in relation to, I just don't like the Happy Meals version of health that imagines that there is such a state, considering that from day one, we're headed towards death, and we better come to terms with it in some way.
Yeah, but also, I mean, I've had discussions in other rooms about the rituals of death which have been denied during COVID. You know, that entire thing about not being present, not having the contact with the person, the deceased, the rituals that have been not dispensed with but prohibited. You know, this kind of passage that you're denied by the family, especially. Yeah. Well, that's a whole other discussion as well.
That's what I was going to say. That's what I was going to exactly.
These are the rabbit holes we can go down in future.
Well, the first thing I learned when you visit Naples is if you're invited to someone's house for dinner, there's always a place at the table where there's a proper table setting with silverware and a plate, but it's only for the dead relative who never.
Well, it was censored. Ladies and gentlemen, any more questions or any to our guests?
Hello.
Hi.
Am I hearable? Hi, my name is Maria, and it was really interesting to observe this shift from admiring beauty to horror. And I'm wondering, as nowadays we are not suppressed, we are not judged for being over-emotional. The category of some excitement being out of place or being improper is no longer valid. It's, let's say, chronic. Aren't we sort of dumb and incapable of experiencing such intense emotions by being exposed to all sorts of strong impulses and by being allowed to experience everything at the same time? I've been thinking about the concept of anesthetic developed by Wolfgang Welsch, anesthetic related both to aesthetic and anesthesia. Welsch addressed a condition caused by an overloading of aesthetic impulses. And I'm wondering, are we still so fragile, so sensitive and capable of responding? That's a question to all of you. Hello?
Donald, Jeff, Koan.
What's that?
Doctor.
What was the question, Doctor? What's the question?
I wanted to hear it rephrased. I mean, what came to mind was the intubated and paralyzed patient affected with COVID. That came to mind.
No.
Go ahead. Maybe you can rephrase it.
Yeah, I didn't mean I didn't talk about the COVID actually. I was just wondering if we are still fragile enough and sensitive and capable of responding, you know, to respond, to feel the Stendall effect. Are we still capable of this kind of experience, or perhaps we are really overloaded with different emotions and intense experiences.
I mean, you're asking it like a yes or no
symbol.
question.
No,
right?
well, I'd like to know what is your opinion, because I'm wondering. I really miss this feeling, and I'd like to experience this. And I'm wondering if we are still so capable, because often when I talk to people about it, it doesn't really happen very often that people come across this experience.
Yeah, well, well, the short answer is yes. I mean, we all still have our sensory apparatus intact and are capable of it. I think it's a matter of protection where we do anesthetize ourselves or desensitize ourselves to those experiences. I was only referring not to COVID itself, but the experience of the paralyzed patient in terms of being loss of control, loss of basically bodily function. You have a machine that's breathing for you. I was referring to that kind of anesthesia as you're referring to. Because I was asked to, how do we treat these people? How do we help them? And part of it was to create a video, actually a VR experience in terms of bringing them into another mental space. We're talking about architecture and spaces now. Bring them to another space with light and sound, in terms of having them escape from the cacophony of the critical care unit with all of its bells and whistles, literally bells and whistles and alarms, and being manipulated in that environment. That was a reference to COVID. It was not necessarily for COVID, but the anesthetized patient or the anesthetized person, in which the control of bodily function has been taken, and sensations are superseded by this intervention of panic, or decreasing panic, through light and sound, through virtual reality. Maybe you can give Maria an example of what you're speaking of. Can you have a personal experience that can exemplify what you're talking about as well?
Okay, I'm. When I was, as we were talking, and Drew was talking about his early childhood experiences, I must say that when I was a little girl, my mother really paid a lot of attention to give me different tools and take me to museums and show art. And one of the strongest impressions and feelings I've ever experienced was to visit the National Museum of Art in Poland, in Warsaw, and it was the painting of Ferdynand Ruszczyk, The Soil. It's a landscape painting of representing a man over a field of soil, and it was really overwhelming. And every time I went to the museum, it was the first thing for me to visit. It was just to run to that room and see this painting. And I miss this kind of experience nowadays.
So you revisited the painting without the same experience? Is that what you're saying?
No, not really. It's really hard to explain. It was just that there was this factor of pilgrimage,
right?
And such, just. Oh God, I got. I'm sorry.
Are you okay?
I think, yeah, I'm trying to focus, because I was recalling other memories, because now, and I was never as I think as impressed with other work of art as I was as that little girl at that time. And I wonder if it was just if I got immune later on, or if it was something wrong with with my sensitivity, or if it was just one of the first experiences that was really so strong. And I'm wondering how it works with you.
Well, I would be wondering what the changes in experience as you grew older into adulthood, what the evolution of those emotions were. You're talking about, the anesthesia. And so what were the things that dropped out or were heightened as an evolution of your ages looking at that painting, revisiting that painting?
It was still powerful. I must say it was still powerful.
Right. But can you be specific about the symptoms that may have changed over the years you were experiencing it? I mean, what power was lost or gained over time?
Yeah, I guess I have to pay a visit when I'm in Warsaw next time and look at it from this point of view and just try to analyze all the gains and all the losses.
Well, my understanding, Maria, of what you were saying was a little bit different. I thought you were talking about a like, let's say, a primal experience of this of being overwhelmed or totally fascinated, etc., which then later you were not really able to repeat, except in front of this painting, maybe. And it seems that you are asking. Is there maybe, can it be that once experienced, the ability to experience gets lost? I mean, that would be one reading, I think, of what you were saying, Maria.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yes, you're right. That's what you're talking about. It's partly this.
Right.
Are there any photographs of you and the work itself? Does a representation of the painting bring on the same experiences of your evolving emotions with this painting?
I think, Maria, if I may say so, speaking of knowing your work, it just opened my mind, because I mean, most of your work, or quite a lot of your work, is about soil. It is about,
yes, I must say,
your installations is actually the enhanced sensation which you could have drawn from this primary experience. That's what I realized.
Could be, yes. Yes, actually, I've never thought of it.
Because in your works that I remember from our class, you had this breathing earth, and you actually literally brought the earth into the gallery, and also the other sensation, like the smell of the earth, of the wet soil. It all is in your work, somehow enhanced. So
yes, I must say that soil is a really important thing in my art way, because I work with it as with material, and it's on one hand just material, not just, it is material, and on the other hand it is a topic. So it's so yes.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the haptic and the olfactory components also of the work. I wish we could see the original. I'm not familiar with the original work, and your work, neither the original nor your work, Maria, but it would be interesting to look at both of those at some point.
Thanks so much. So the soil is both subject and matter in what I do. But I basically do gloomy things, so so I'm rather in this horror part of our conversation.
Do you incorporate soil into the paintings? I mean, is it mixed in with any medium, or is it depiction of soil?
No. It's just soil itself. I make complex installations using soil.
Okay, I didn't understand that, which is why I asked. Okay. So there definitely is that haptic and olfactory component.
What I'm saying is that I didn't know this primary sensation of yours, and knowing your work, because you never mentioned this sensation. So it just changed very much my perception of your work also. Maria, and I think speaking of a description is like it's fascinating, because if I say wet soil, we all somehow can sense it, even though I just pronounced the word wet soil, but we can all feel it very much. And this is as close as you can get to your work, I think. This description.
Yes, because I'm really. It is important for me to use different senses, not only the eye. So the oculocentric point of view and its tradition is difficult for me, because I also really cherish different senses, like you say, smell and touch, and that's why I'm really focused on installation, and it is my favorite medium.
Yeah. Do you think your familiarity or your working with the material had any kind of desensitization or anesthetic effect on your response to the painting?
It's a difficult question. I guess I have to think it over. I don't have the ready response right now.
Right. I mean, that was a question you posed to me. This is why I'm asking. Yeah.
Well,
I know, that's why
it could be also
yes.
it could be also reconstructed in an almost inverse way, as you know. I mean, this complete speculation, of course, now that there is like a primary experience that then afterwards you desperately or not desperately try to retrieve, you know. And in this case, possibly, I mean, as Maria told us to us, it was the experience of a painting, and now she's working with the real material, installation, etc., including all different kinds of senses, you know, and that in some sort of way. And once again, it's just a fantasy now. It may sound like the effort to reconstruct, and I mean, it's as if there was an ongoing desire to find back a primary experience, and you include all different kinds of methods and approaches, etc., and you never really get it, you know. I mean, this is what is called desire.
Perhaps, yes.
Ulrich, I totally agree with you. There's a kind of obsession for people to go back to Proust and say that he's recovered all these memories, to talk about their synesthesia and how wonderful it is, those cookies and things like that. But in my view, if you read Proust, it's obsessing about the loss of these memories. And obsessing about the inaccessibility. In terms of the jouissance that you get from these encounters, there are two questions. I think one is, if the encounter was truly exceptional, how many in one lifetime do you really need? You know, the issue is not that we have them when we lost them, but that we have lost them in a certain way that becomes extremely meaningful for us in the context of that loss. So, you know, Freud was famous for saying, people would come to him and say, "Oh, I have this oceanic feeling. I experience a oneness with nature," and he would say, "Well, I have no idea what you're talking about." and the interesting thing is, we know that Freud was lying. We knew very well that he knew what they were talking about, and then he actually said, but he denied it. Freud is denying. So the interesting thing about denial and loss is they in fact constitute our situation. With respect to the Stendall Syndrome, is we are suddenly and unexpectedly recaptured by something we thought we had lost. As carefully as we put our camera up to the beautiful view, or as carefully as we distance ourselves from the magnificent work of art, or even if we're a pilgrim, as carefully as we prayed all along the way to San Capistella, that, you know, yes, we want to confront this thing, but we don't want to totally die. We want to come away and survive. But, you know, things can go wrong. And and so I think the complex of things you're talking about with Earth, it just means that you have designed a way to experience synesthetically something that is really unbearable. You know, what's unbearable about Earth is the beauty of the smell, the richness of the smell that we know is filled, permeated with death. Why is it so wonderful? We can't really face that kind of synesthesia. You know, and early you characterized our theory of the syndrome as shit. I love that. Absolutely true. I totally agree with you. To me, that relates directly to the Earth part.
It's a very interesting. One could, I think, go on speculating because, and I'm inclined to say, good for you, Maria, that you don't get it back, you know, because that keeps you making your things, right? And this poor tourist that is thunderstruck or struck by the lightning of this overwhelming beauty, you know, he gets taken to the hospital and sent back to where he comes from, or she, you know. So it's not only more healthy, it's also more interesting. I mean, usually, I mean, this is unfortunately usually the truth. I think that loss and denial, that's more interesting and more generative than this fulfillment, you know, that these poor guys experience. Sorry, what did you say, Maria? Yes.
It's like Ulysses, right? Live to tell the tale.
Right.
Great.
And this is why also this healing idea is so suspicious, you know? It's so suspicious.
Absolutely. Right.
Yeah, you're talking about death. I had this idea of a book about cancer, which is one cell's search for immortality.
You mentioned this to me.
Yeah, so something I want to develop. I haven't quite found the hook yet, but it is an interesting perspective, you know.
You also, I remember this fascinating conversation with you about the antidepressants and pro-depressants, which was related to this sudden death of one of these Russian oligarchs who apparently hanged himself somewhere in London. And that was the time we met, and we were discussing this plot of this perfect crime.
Right.
Caused not by because logically speaking, you can take antidepressants as a form of healing, but also if there are antidepressants, there must be pro-depressants, meaning that you don't have to kill anybody. It's enough to give him a pill, and then he will kill himself. Wonderful conversation.
I remember.
Well,
I've always thought it's fascinating that half the world wants to live in eternity, and the other half of the world wants to get out of it.
Great. Well,
I'm fascinated with the people who have had their brains preserved, waiting for the resurrection of technology to catch up with them to revive them.
Like Walt
What will become?
That should be the last organ to preserve. Well, you know, Zizek has this riff on what happens if you die and then you find out, my God, there is eternal life, and you go to heaven and or wherever, and he says you would go through the same stages of grief that people do when they face the death of a loved one. First, denial. You know, this can't be happening to me, and then it gradually sinks in that every other day is going to be exactly like today. And then it occurs to you that the very thing you had hoped for, that is to survive death, is exactly what you don't want.
It's astounding that these rabbit holes have been going on for nearly 3 hours now.
Yes. And I'm not the one, and I'm definitely not the one who's going to stop it. So it just if you're completely exhausted, then I'll make my part and soon. But I'm not the one who's going to finish this lecture because it's a feast. So thank you.
No. It's not a signal for closure. I was just making a notation. The sun has risen here in Hawaii.
Oh, really?
I'm surrounded in sun, from darkness into sunshine.
Yes. That's wonderful to watch, all of us. It's like, and for some of us, it's getting darker, and now it's like with me and Ulrich and Drew, it's a sunset with you, and it's a sunrise.
With us, Koan, under these circumstances.
No,
Fantastic.
it's a pleasure.
Well, I can say, Dominic, I'm ready for my glass of wine of the evening, which means that I have to go somewhere else, and I mean, to the kitchen at least. And to leave this post here.
For the same, Ulrich, and I hope that one day we'll be able to share a glass of wine live. Yes. You know, and once again, as long as the desire is still there and it's not fulfilled, it's even more, you know, tempting. Absolutely.
Exactly. I think tantalizing is the
tantalizing. Okay.
Yes. With Tantalus. Remember the thing that was just beyond the grass.
Yes.
So let's keep this temptation going. And Koan, Donald, thank you so much for this feast today. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Great pleasure.
See you in the next 2 weeks for the Mario Cairo talk. I hope you have a chance to join us. That would be wonderful.
Maria, can I ask, or Dominic, can you connect Maria and myself? I want to look at her work and then to see the work.
I will pass you the contacts. Absolutely.
Okay.
And also,
speaking
of the modest crowd, except Maria, as usual, if there are any questions, please write me so I will forward them to Donald and Koan, because sometimes there is always the l'esprit d'escalier that we all suffer from in such situations. So I'll pass the questions, and it was wonderful to see you. And I hope to see you again within the next 2 weeks for the Mario Cairo talk.
Very cool.
Fantastic.
Very cool. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye now.
Even Yehuda visible now. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Good night.
Dziękuję. Dziękuję.
Dziękuję. Dziękuję.
I came late, but I... Bye-bye.